On October 3, 1939, deep beneath the gray waters of the North Atlantic, a German U-boat descended into darkness, with orders that would fundamentally reshape the course of World War II and test Britain's very existence as a nation. This is the story of how one fateful month transformed a distant European conflict into an existential struggle that would demand everything from the British people, forcing them to confront not just the Nazi war machine, but the chilling possibility that they might lose everything their civilization had built over centuries of history. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany just a month earlier, on September 3rd, the nation had done so with grim determination, but also with a peculiar sense of unreality, a feeling that the actual conflict seemed somehow distant and abstract, as if the declaration itself might be enough to deter Hitler from further aggression. The opening weeks of the conflict had been genuinely strange, a time that observers would later dub the Phoney War, a term that captured the bewildering disconnect between the fact of war and its apparent absence from British experience. While German armies were already devastating Poland in a shocking demonstration of mechanized blitzkrieg warfare that horrified observers and introduced the world to a terrifying new kind of military science, Britain itself remained largely untouched by violence, and for many citizens living in the green countryside and bustling cities, the war felt like an abstraction, something happening far away, something that might still be resolved through negotiation or simply through the passage of time, and the hope that cooler heads would ultimately prevail. The BBC continued to broadcast its regular programming, children went to school, factories hummed with production, and while there were air raid shelters being built and gas masks being distributed, there was a strange calm over the island, a sense that perhaps the two nations might maintain a kind of armed standoff without descending into the total warfare that had characterized the First World War. But in early October, as if someone had finally switched on a terrible light that illuminated a landscape of danger and suffering, the war arrived at Britain's doorstep with devastating and unmistakable suddenness, and the nation would never recover its former sense of safety or security. The instrument of this arrival was the U-boat, Nazi Germany's submarine weapon, a vessel of death that operated silently and invisibly beneath the waves, striking without warning and leaving no opportunity for mercy or escape. The waters surrounding Britain were about to become a vast graveyard where thousands of brave merchant sailors would lose their lives in the coming years, a genuine arena of violence where Britain would face its greatest threat not from invasion by German troops or bombardment from German aircraft, but from something far more insidious and terrifying: the slow starvation of an island nation that depended absolutely on overseas supplies to feed its population and sustain its war effort. The submarine threat had begun to manifest itself in late September, when the passenger liner SS Athenia was torpedoed without warning off the coast of Ireland, claiming 112 innocent lives and shattering any remaining illusions among the British public that this war would be somehow more civilized or restrained than the brutal, mechanized slaughter of the First World War. That single incident had shocked the nation and raised terrifying questions about whether any ship on the ocean could be safe, whether German submarines would respect the conventions of naval warfare, whether the seas themselves had become a zone of unrestricted killing. But the sinking of the Athenia was merely the opening note in a terrible symphony of destruction that would reach its crescendo in the coming months and years as the German Kriegsmarine unleashed its U-boats with a ferocity and determination that would ultimately threaten to starve Britain into submission and completely alter the strategic landscape of the entire war. The British, with their centuries-long tradition of naval supremacy dating back to the Spanish Armada and their island economy that depended absolutely on overseas trade to function, were about to discover that their greatest historical strength had become their greatest contemporary vulnerability in this new form of total warfare. For Britain was no longer a great land power projecting force across distant continents and colonies through the application of military strength. It was a small island nation whose survival depended entirely on its ability to maintain supply lines across thousands of miles of the Atlantic Ocean. And these lines were about to be attacked with methodical, relentless, and devastating efficiency by an enemy that had calculated precisely how to hurt Britain most grievously. The British possessed a navy, yes, the greatest navy in the world by any measure at that time, a navy that had dominated the seas for more than a century. But navies are designed to fight other navies in grand fleet engagements, not to escort slow-moving merchant convoys across vast distances, not to protect vulnerable cargo ships from invisible attackers that struck from beneath the waves and then disappeared into the depths. This represented a fundamental mismatch between the nature of Britain's naval strength and the nature of the threat it now faced. And it would take years of adaptation, innovation, and sacrificial learning to develop the tactics and technology necessary to defend against the submarine menace. The opening of October 1939 therefore marked the true beginning of Britain's war, not the phony beginning of September, filled with declarations and public assurances, but the real, brutal, unforgiving beginning that would test the nation's courage, its ingenuity, its resolve, and its willingness to sacrifice everything for survival. The man who would eventually come to embody this struggle, who would transform Britain from a dazed and uncertain nation into a determined and defiant people capable of enduring almost anything, had not yet risen to the full power and authority he would need. But he was waiting in the wings, ready for his moment of destiny. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, the maverick politician with his dramatic speeches and his cigar and his combative personality, had spent the long interwar years warning against the Nazi threat, while his more cautious and diplomatically minded contemporaries sought accommodation and compromise with Hitler's increasingly aggressive regime. Churchill had been the voice crying in the wilderness, the man who understood that appeasement was merely postponement, that Hitler could not be appeased, but only opposed, and that the only language dictators understood was the language of superior force. But in 1939, Churchill was serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, the position he had held at the start of the First World War, when he was a younger man and a more impetuous decision-maker. And while this was an important position, it was not the supreme position of authority that he would eventually need to command if Britain was to survive its greatest trial. The man who still held the office of Prime Minister was Neville Chamberlain, the man who had pursued the policy of appeasement so faithfully, who had met with Hitler and believed he had achieved a lasting peace through negotiation and compromise, the man who had returned to London just a year earlier, waving a piece of paper and declaring with absolute confidence that he had brought back peace for our time, a phrase that had become a bitter joke and a symbol of miscalculation in the months since its utterance. Chamberlain had genuinely believed that the Munich Agreement of 1938, in which Britain and France had allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, had satisfied Hitler's territorial ambitions, and that he had thereby secured lasting peace. But Hitler had had other ideas, other ambitions, and when German troops invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, Chamberlain's entire policy of appeasement had been revealed as a tragic failure, and the Prime Minister had become a symbol of failed leadership and misguided optimism. Yet despite this failure, Chamberlain remained in office, hoping perhaps that through continued steady management and careful diplomacy, he might still guide the nation to some kind of acceptable outcome. A vain hope that would be shattered by the events of October 1939. As October unfolded, as the first U-boats began their relentless attacks on British merchant shipping, as the first British ships were sent to the bottom of the sea, as the first British sailors died in the cold and dark waters of the Atlantic, the mood in the country began to shift palpably, and the inadequacy of Chamberlain's leadership became increasingly and undeniably apparent to everyone from the man in the street to the members of Parliament. The British public was not yet frightened in the way they would become after the Blitz and the bombing campaign, but they were alert, and they were beginning to understand with growing clarity that this war would be nothing like what they had imagined when they went to bed on September 2nd. The newspapers were filled with reports of ships being sunk, of convoys being attacked in the darkness, of brave merchant sailors perishing in the icy waters of the Atlantic. And while the British government tried to maintain an outward appearance of calm and assure the population that the Royal Navy was in complete control of the situation, everyone could sense that something fundamental had changed, that the nature of the threat had shifted in ways that nobody had fully anticipated. The Germans had deployed a weapon that the British were not entirely prepared to counter, a weapon that could strike with deadly precision from an invisible position, a weapon that turned the vast protective ocean that had surrounded and protected Britain for centuries into a killing field where death could come at any moment without warning or mercy. The U-boat campaign, which would later be formally called the Battle of the Atlantic, was in its infancy in October 1939, just beginning its relentless expansion. But already it was becoming clear to anyone paying attention that this would be no ordinary naval warfare, with battles between fleets and destroyers engaging in surface combat. Instead, the Germans were pursuing a strategy of economic warfare, seeking not to destroy the British fleet in some climactic naval encounter, but rather to wear Britain down through attrition and starvation, to slowly strangle its economy by preventing the food and raw materials that sustained the island population from reaching its shores. Every merchant ship sunk represented far more than a tactical victory in some military engagement. It represented a strategic blow against Britain's capacity to continue fighting, a gradual reduction in the supplies available to feed the population and power the war machine, a step closer to the point at which Britain might be forced to surrender not because of military defeat, but because of sheer economic exhaustion. And the British, for all their vaunted naval tradition and their undeniable naval power, found themselves in an unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable position. They were defending rather than attacking. They were reacting to threats rather than projecting power across the globe, as they were accustomed to doing. They were vulnerable in a way that no British leader had seriously contemplated in living memory. The Atlantic Ocean, which had once been essentially a British lake, a vast protective moat surrounding the island fortress and enabling Britain to project power across the world while remaining secure at home, had suddenly become a battlefield. And the British found themselves struggling to adapt to this entirely new form of naval warfare. By October 1939, the basic outlines of this new and terrifying reality were beginning to become clear, and the implications were absolutely staggering in their scope and severity. If the Germans could successfully strangle British supply lines, if they could prevent food and war materials and raw materials from reaching Britain, then Britain would lose the war, not on some distant battlefield in France or elsewhere, but in its own ports, its own warehouses, its own streets, in the empty bellies of its own people. This was a kind of warfare, a kind of strategic competition that Britain had never had to seriously contemplate before, a warfare of slow attrition and patient strangulation, rather than decisive military action and glorious victory. And it demanded not just military innovation in tactics and technology, but a complete restructuring and reorganization of British society itself. The total mobilization of every resource that could be spared, the coordination of every effort toward a single overarching goal, national survival. The month of October 1939 was therefore a turning point, not because of any single dramatic military event, not because of any great battle lost or won, or any strategic victory or devastating defeat, but because it was the crucial moment when Britain began to understand with absolute clarity what it was truly facing, what the full scope of the challenge really was. The comfortable delusions of the Phoney War, The half-conscious belief that perhaps this war might be limited and brief and resolved through negotiation were beginning to evaporate like morning mist, replaced instead by a grim and unforgiving recognition that the nation faced an existential threat to its very existence as an independent power. The war that had seemed distant, almost like theater, almost unreal in its abstraction, in September, was suddenly and undeniably and viscerally real in October, and there was no more possibility of maintaining the fiction that this was anything other than a life or death struggle. And this transformation in understanding would transform Britain itself, would demand sacrifices and changes that would ripple through every single aspect of British society, economy, and culture for the rest of the war and far beyond, shaping the post-war world in ways that nobody could have predicted on that gray October day. The British people themselves were beginning to change their fundamental understanding of what this war meant, what it would demand of them, what hardships they would have to endure if they were to survive and ultimately to win against an enemy that seemed determined to fight to the bitter end. The government, under continued pressure from public opinion and from members of Parliament who were increasingly dissatisfied with Chamberlain's leadership, began to accelerate the mobilization of the economy, converting factories from the production of consumer goods to the production of war materials and military equipment, conscripting men into the armed forces and women into auxiliary services, implementing rationing to ensure fair distribution of scarce resources, and building air raid shelters and defenses against what everyone knew must come eventually, a bombing campaign from the air. The institutions of British society were being fundamentally remade for war, reorganized and restructured in ways that would persist for years after 1945. And while this process of mobilization and organization had officially begun in September with the declaration of war, it was in October that it became clear to everyone just how total and all-consuming this transformation would have to be if the nation was to have any hope of survival. The civil service, the armed forces, local government, churches, schools, factories, docks, railways, every institution and organization in the nation began to bend its energies toward the single goal of national survival and victory. Civilians were being asked to give up comforts and securities that they had long taken for granted. Young men were being conscripted to risk their lives. Women were being asked to take on new roles in industry and service. Children were being evacuated from cities to relative safety in the countryside. The entire social order was being mobilized and reorganized for total war. The implications of this mobilization were profound and far-reaching, touching every family in the nation, every workplace, every community from the industrial heartland of the Midlands to the quiet villages of the home counties, to the fishing ports of Scotland and the Welsh valleys. By October 3rd, 1939, Britain had therefore crossed an invisible but absolutely crucial threshold, a threshold that would mark the true and authentic beginning of its war as a total national struggle, rather than a distant political conflict. The nation that had hoped it could muddle through the conflict, as it had so often done in its long history, that had believed perhaps that some last-minute accommodation might still be reached with Nazi Germany, if only the right diplomatic approach could be found, that had hoped for a relatively limited conflict that would not tear apart the entire fabric of British society and culture, was beginning to wake up to a much harsher and far more terrifying reality than anyone had wanted to contemplate. The Phoney War was ending, and real war, total war, existential war was beginning, and everyone could feel it happening, could sense the gathering darkness and the trials that lay ahead. This is the story of that profound transformation. The story of how Britain went from a nation hoping to avoid catastrophe through diplomacy and compromise to a nation determined and resolved to defy the Nazi threat, even if it meant fighting alone, and ultimately to overcome the seemingly insurmountable odds arrayed against it through sheer courage, determination, and the refusal to surrender, even in the darkest hours. It is a story of extraordinary courage and sacrifice, of remarkable innovation and determination in the face of terrible odds, of a people forced to confront the very real possibility of their own extinction and national obliteration, and who chose instead to fight with everything they had. It is a story that begins on October 3, 1939, with German U-boats hunting in the darkness of the Atlantic, with merchant ships being sent to the bottom of the sea, and with the British people beginning to understand the magnitude of the struggle before them, and which would ultimately span 6 more years of warfare, millions of deaths, and the complete transformation of the entire world order. The events of early October 1939 crystallized and clarified the essential nature of the conflict that Britain faced, stripping away all the comfortable illusions and forcing the British people and their government to confront certain hard truths that they had been reluctant to accept. This was not going to be a short war that would be resolved in a matter of months through the application of superior naval power. Nor was it going to be a war won through the mere existence of imperial resources or through successful diplomatic negotiation and compromise. This was going to be a total war, a war that would demand everything from everyone, that would threaten everything the nation held dear, and that would completely transform everything about British life and British society. The turning point of October 3, 1939, was therefore not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of an even longer and more terrible struggle. But it was undoubtedly the moment when the British people and British government finally began to understand the true magnitude of the challenge they faced, and the lengths they would have to go to in order to survive and ultimately prevail against an enemy that showed no mercy and asked for none. From this moment forward, nothing would ever be quite the same, and the nation that had once believed it could coast through the war on the strength of its past military glory and its naval tradition and its imperial power would be forced to reinvent itself completely, to find new sources of strength in places and ways that nobody had expected, to dig deeper into its reserves of courage and determination and resilience than perhaps any nation had ever been forced to do before in modern history. The stage was set on October 3, 1939, and the real drama of Britain's war was about to begin in earnest, and it would consume the next 6 years and fundamentally reshape not just Britain, but the entire world and the international order, creating new superpowers and ending centuries of European dominance. October 1939 was the moment of reckoning, the moment when Britain finally understood what it was truly fighting for and what it would have to sacrifice to achieve victory over Nazi totalitarianism. And it was a moment that would be looked back upon by historians across the decades and centuries as the true turning point of the entire Second World War. The moment when the long darkness descended over Britain, and when the British people began their extraordinary journey from despair to defiance to ultimate victory and vindication.